Maya was a young woman full of confidence and grace. She had just finished an evening with her close friends, laughing and sharing stories in a small cafe in town. The air was warm, and the street lights glowed softly as she walked down the sidewalk toward her home. She carried herself with quiet dignity, enjoying the calm night. For her, these little walks were moments of peace, a time to think about her goals and the future she dreamed of building. As she crossed a corner near the park, she noticed a police officer standing by his patrol car. At first, she thought nothing of it. Officers often patrolled the area to keep the neighborhood safe, and she had always believed in showing respect to people in uniform. But as she walked past, she felt his eyes following her steps. She kept her composure, continuing on her way, but the officer called out to her in a casual tone. "Hey, miss," he said, walking toward her. "Out here alone tonight?" Maya turned politely and nodded. "Yes, just heading home." The officer smiled, but there was something in his smile that didn't sit well with her. It wasn't the warm kind of smile people give when they're trying to be friendly, it was more of a look that carried a sense of expectation. He asked for her name, and she answered calmly, not wanting to appear disrespectful. Then, to her surprise, he asked where she lived and if she wanted to grab coffee with him sometime. Maya, taken aback, gave a polite but firm reply. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested." She thought that would be enough. After all, people ask and people refuse, it happens every day. But instead of accepting her response, the officer frowned slightly, as if her answer was somehow unacceptable. He leaned closer and repeated his question, this time with a stronger tone. "You sure? I think we'd have a good time." Again, Maya shook her head, keeping her voice steady. "No, thank you." She didn't want to be rude, but she also didn't want to lead him on or pretend she was interested. Respectfully saying no was her right, and she hoped he would leave it at that. But the officer's face changed. His friendly expression faded, replaced by a look of irritation. His posture stiffened, and his voice carried a sharp edge as he spoke again. "You don't have to act like that. I'm just being nice." Maya felt a knot forming in her stomach. She had been through enough life experiences to know when a situation was shifting from casual to uncomfortable. Still, she stood tall. "I understand, but I'm not interested," she repeated. For a moment, silence hung in the air. The officer studied her, almost as if he couldn't believe she had refused him. His pride seemed bruised, and rather than walk away, he tried to assert more authority. He asked where she was going, demanded to see her ID, and acted as though her simple no was some kind of offense. Maya sighed softly, keeping calm. She handed over her ID, knowing she had nothing to hide. While he looked it over, she glanced around and noticed a few people in the distance, watching quietly. She wished she could just continue on her way without turning this into a scene, but the officer didn't seem ready to let her go. He returned her ID and then said something that made her realize this wasn't just about routine questions. "You should think twice before talking to an officer that way," he muttered. Maya's heart skipped a beat. His words weren't loud, but the message behind them was clear. It wasn't about her safety or the neighborhood, it was about his ego. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her, yet she refused to show fear. "I wasn't being disrespectful," she replied softly. "I just said no." Her voice was steady, and her eyes were clear. She wanted him to know that she wasn't intimidated, but she also wasn't looking for conflict. She was a woman who believed in standing her ground, even when faced with someone who held power. The officer shifted, clearly unsettled by her calm refusal. For a moment, he seemed unsure of what to do next. Maya took a step back, intending to leave the conversation behind, but his voice followed her again. "Wait a minute," he said, raising his hand as if to stop her. She paused. Every instinct told her that she was dealing with someone who was not handling rejection well. But she also knew she had to keep her composure. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze once more. "Yes?" she asked, her tone still polite. The officer hesitated, then forced a smile. "Just, be careful out here," he said, though his voice lacked warmth. Maya nodded and continued walking. Her footsteps echoed softly against the pavement as she put distance between herself and the officer. She could feel his eyes still on her, but she kept moving, not allowing herself to look back. As she walked further, she thought about what had just happened. It wasn't the first time someone had mistaken her politeness for an open door. And it wasn't the first time someone had struggled to accept a firm no, but this was different. This was an officer of the law, a person who should have been protecting her safety, not making her feel uneasy. She sighed deeply, her mind racing. She wasn't just any young woman walking the streets. Her background carried weight, though she rarely spoke about it. She was the daughter of a man who had spent his life serving the nation at the highest level, a Navy admiral whose name commanded respect wherever it was spoken. But Maya didn't wear that title as a shield. She wanted people to see her for who she was, not for her father's rank. Still, she couldn't ignore the thought that the situation could have gone differently if the officer had known who she was. She pushed the thought aside for now, focusing instead on reaching home safely. The night air was cooler as she neared her street. The lamps glowed warmly, casting long shadows on the road. She let herself breathe easier, though her mind replayed the uncomfortable encounter again and again. The officer's irritation, his unwillingness to take no for an answer, and his subtle attempt to use authority had left a bitter taste. Yet Maya reminded herself that she had done the right thing. She had stayed calm, been respectful, and protected her dignity without lowering herself into anger. It wasn't easy, but she had stood her ground. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning of a story that was going to unfold in ways she could not yet imagine. The next evening, Maya's thoughts were still heavy with the memory of what had happened the night before. She had shared the story with no one yet, not even her closest friends. She wasn't the type to create unnecessary noise or drama. But deep inside, she couldn't shake the way the officer's mood had changed after she had simply said no. The memory replayed in her mind like a scene she couldn't pause. His tone, his eyes, and his subtle threat still echoed within her. She decided to keep her normal routine. She didn't want fear to dictate her life. So, when the sun set and the city lights began to glow, Maya stepped out again, walking the familiar path back toward home. The streets were alive with small movements, neighbors watering their plants, children laughing from a distance, and people chatting outside local shops. It was the kind of scene that usually gave her comfort. But tonight felt different. As she turned a corner, she noticed something that made her heart beat faster. The same officer from the night before was parked nearby, leaning against his patrol car. His eyes met hers immediately, almost as if he had been waiting. Maya inhaled deeply, telling herself to stay calm. She wasn't doing anything wrong, she had nothing to fear. Yet the uneasiness in her chest grew heavier with every step. "Out again?" the officer asked, pushing himself upright and stepping toward her. His tone was sharp, not at all like the casual greeting from the first encounter. Maya nodded. "Yes. Just heading home." He studied her carefully. Then, instead of moving on with his duties, he stopped directly in her path. His posture carried a sense of control, as though he wanted her to feel trapped. She kept her eyes steady on him, refusing to show discomfort, even though inside her nerves were tightening. "You didn't think about what I said yesterday?" he asked, his words dripping with annoyance. Maya remained calm. "I told you my answer. It hasn't changed." The officer's jaw clenched. His pride had taken another hit, and his frustration was growing visible. Maya noticed his hand hovering near his belt, not as a threat but as a subtle reminder of the power he believed he held. The street grew quieter around them. A few pedestrians slowed down, sensing tension, but no one stepped forward yet. "You shouldn't talk like that," he muttered, his voice low but heavy with warning. "Do you know who you're speaking to?" Maya took a slow breath. She understood the hidden meaning. This was no longer about a simple refusal, this was about control. He wanted her to bend, to show submission. But she wasn't built that way. "With respect," she said softly, "I know exactly who I'm speaking to. But I also know my right to say no." The words hung in the air like a stone thrown into still water. The officer's expression shifted into something darker. His patience had run thin, and his ego was bruised beyond repair. Without warning, his tone escalated. "You think you can just walk away?" he demanded. His hand now rested firmly on the side of his belt. Maya froze, though her face showed no fear. Inside, her heart raced, but she refused to let it show. Slowly, she turned her head, noticing that a few more people had gathered at a distance. Some had already raised their phones, recording the moment silently. The presence of witnesses gave her a small sense of safety, but it also meant the situation was becoming public. The officer stepped closer, his shadow stretching across her. His presence was heavy, but Maya's voice remained steady. "I have not disrespected you," she said. "I only declined an invitation. That should be the end of it." But her calmness only made him more unsettled. He wanted to see fear in her eyes, not strength. And when he didn't, his pride pushed him to escalate further. He raised his voice loudly enough for everyone around to hear. "You need to stop right now," he shouted. Another patrol car pulled up nearby. A second officer stepped out, curious about the situation. He walked over, looked at Maya, then back at his colleague. "What's going on here?" he asked. The first officer wasted no time. "She's being uncooperative," he declared. Maya's eyes widened slightly at the unfair accusation, but she didn't interrupt. She knew every word she spoke now mattered. She glanced at the second officer, who seemed uncertain, torn between supporting his partner and questioning the tension he had just walked into. "She hasn't done anything wrong," Maya said calmly, addressing the second officer. "I am simply walking home. I was stopped without cause." Her words were clear, but the first officer's anger only deepened. He wanted control of the story, and he wasn't going to let her win it easily. His hand inched closer toward his belt again, sending a ripple of gasps through the small crowd forming nearby. People held up their phones higher, determined to capture every moment. Maya's breath grew shallow, but she did not move. Inside her mind, she repeated the same thought: "Stay calm. Do not give them a reason." She had been raised with discipline and composure, and tonight those lessons were her shield. The silence stretched for a long moment before the second officer spoke again. "Maybe we should slow down here," he suggested cautiously. "People are watching." But the first officer didn't want to listen. His pride was louder than reason. He looked back at Maya, his eyes sharp with challenge. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" he sneered. Maya didn't flinch. Her voice remained even, though her heart pounded. "No one is untouchable," she said softly. "But everyone deserves respect." The words landed heavier than she expected. Even some in the crowd nodded in agreement, murmuring among themselves. The truth in her statement was undeniable. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't resisting, she was simply standing in dignity. The first officer felt the control slipping from his hands. The attention of the public, the calmness of the woman before him, and the uncertainty of his colleague were all pressing against his authority. He wanted to make her bow, but instead, he was the one being challenged not through force, but through her unwavering calm. The crowd grew thicker. More phones pointed at them. Every second stretched like a rope being pulled tighter and tighter. And Maya stood there, still, collected, a figure of quiet defiance in the face of intimidation. She knew this moment was only the beginning of something bigger. Her heart told her that the situation was about to break open in ways neither she nor the officer could control. What she didn't know yet was just how far-reaching the consequences would be, and how one choice, one refusal, could light a fire that could not be hidden anymore. The air grew heavier as the crowd thickened. Phones hovered in the air like silent witnesses, catching every glance, every word, and every movement. Maya stood quietly, her hands relaxed at her sides, though her heart was racing faster than she wanted to admit. She knew that one wrong word, one wrong gesture, could tilt the entire situation in the wrong direction. The officer, the same one who had pressed her for attention the night before, stood stiff with anger. His pride had been wounded in front of strangers, and he didn't know how to step back without looking weak. He wanted control. He wanted her silence. But Maya's calm strength had left him unsettled. The second officer shifted uneasily, glancing at the crowd and then at his partner. It was clear he didn't know the full story, and he wasn't sure where the truth lay. He asked again, more carefully this time, what exactly happened here? Maya inhaled deeply, keeping her voice calm. I was walking home, she explained. I was stopped, questioned, and treated unfairly. I've done nothing wrong. The second officer's brow furrowed. Her tone didn't match the accusations. She wasn't loud, she wasn't disrespectful, and she certainly wasn't resisting. Her composure made it hard to believe she was guilty of anything. The first officer, unwilling to lose his grip, interrupted. She's being difficult, he said sharply. She refuses to cooperate. A ripple of murmurs spread through the onlookers. Some whispered to each other, shaking their heads. From their perspective, Maya had done nothing but stand her ground. The videos being recorded captured everything: the officer's frustration, her calmness, and the growing tension. Maya could feel the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. She had kept her identity hidden, but she knew she was reaching a breaking point. She had tried to handle this quietly, but the situation had spiraled beyond what she could manage with silence alone. She looked directly at the officer, her eyes steady, and said clearly, "You're making a mistake." He narrowed his eyes. "What mistake?" he demanded. Maya took another breath. She hadn't wanted to reveal it, but now the time had come. "Do you know who I am?" she asked softly, but loud enough for the crowd to hear. The officer gave a mocking laugh, dismissing her words. "You think you're someone special? Out here, you're just another person I have to deal with." The second officer tilted his head, watching her carefully. There was something in her voice, something that carried weight and certainty, not arrogance. Maya finally said the words she had been holding back. "I am the daughter of Admiral Jonathan Carter." The name dropped into the air like a heavy stone into water. Silence spread through the crowd. A few gasps were heard. Even those who didn't know much about the military recognized the title. An admiral was not a small rank, it was one of the highest. To be his daughter meant she carried a connection to authority that extended far beyond the street. The first officer's mocking expression faltered. He blinked, caught off guard, before quickly shaking his head. "You're lying," he said harshly. "Don't play games with me." But Maya didn't waver. "I'm not lying," she said firmly. "Call the base. Ask anyone. You'll learn the truth." The second officer stepped back, uncertainty spreading across his face. He had heard of Admiral Carter. Many had. The Admiral was known for his discipline, his fairness, and his reputation in service. The thought that the young woman standing in front of them could be his daughter made the situation suddenly heavier. From the crowd, a voice rose. "I know her," a man called out, holding up his phone. "She's telling the truth. That's Admiral Carter's daughter." More murmurs spread, and the atmosphere shifted. What had started as an attempt to control and intimidate was quickly slipping into something far more dangerous for the officer. He had not just mishandled a citizen, he had mishandled someone whose family name carried weight at the highest levels. The first officer's face flushed. He looked around, suddenly aware of the crowd, the cameras, and the fact that his actions were no longer hidden in the dark corners of authority. Yet, his pride fought against reason. "I don't care who she says she is," he barked. "She's still causing trouble." But the second officer wasn't convinced. His eyes darted between Maya and his partner, and doubt filled his posture. "Maybe we should confirm this," he suggested carefully. Maya, still calm, pulled out her phone. With steady fingers, she dialed a number. The crowd watched closely. A few whispered that she was bluffing, but most waited in silence, their cameras recording every detail. When the call connected, Maya's voice softened slightly. "Dad? It's me," she said. "I need you to know something. I've been stopped. Again." The silence that followed was heavier than any word spoken before. The officer standing in front of her stiffened as realization dawned that she was truly speaking to someone important. The crowd leaned closer, trying to catch every word. Maya continued, her voice even. "Yes, I'm safe. But I think you should know what's happening." Within moments, the officer's radio crackled. A voice from the dispatch called urgently, "Stand by. Command has been notified. Hold your position." The first officer froze, his hand still hovering near his belt. He looked shaken now, unsure of what to do. His face lost its certainty, replaced by the panic of a man who suddenly realized the gravity of his actions. The second officer stepped back, his hands raised slightly as if to distance himself from the situation. "Sir," he whispered to his partner, "I think she's telling the truth. You need to stop." But stopping was no longer enough. The mistake had already been made, and the eyes of the crowd, along with their cameras, had captured it all. The truth was out, and it was spreading faster than anyone could contain it. Maya ended her call and looked back at the officers. She didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. Her calmness was louder than any shout. "I told you. You're making a mistake." The weight of her words settled over the street. The officer who had tried to control her stood frozen, no longer the figure of authority he had pretended to be. The tables had turned. What he thought was a moment of power had transformed into a moment of exposure. Maya didn't smile, didn't gloat. She wasn't here to win a battle of pride. She was here to stand for her dignity, for her right to be respected like any other person. And now, with the truth revealed, the world around her began to see the situation for what it really was. The street had fallen into a strange silence, the kind that comes when everyone realizes they are witnessing something important. The crowd stood with their phones raised, their eyes moving between Maya and the officers. Even the children who had been laughing earlier were now quiet, sensing the tension. The first officer, who only moments ago carried himself with confidence, looked as though the ground beneath him had shifted. His jaw tightened, and his eyes darted nervously at the crowd, at the cameras, and then back at Maya. For the first time, he wasn't sure how to handle the situation. He had built his authority on fear and control, but neither of those worked against Maya. The radio on his shoulder crackled again. This time the voice was firmer, more commanding. "Units on site, hold your position. Command is en route." The words made the second officer step back quickly. He understood exactly what it meant. Someone important had been notified, and soon they would arrive. He looked at his partner with a mixture of disbelief and caution, realizing the situation was no longer just about them, it had climbed to a much higher level. Maya stood still, her posture calm. Inside, her heart still raced, but she refused to let it show. She had grown up watching her father in countless formal settings, always steady, never letting emotions rule his judgment. Tonight, she carried those same lessons within her. The first officer finally spoke, but his voice lacked the strength it had earlier. You think this changes anything?" he said, though his words carried more uncertainty than conviction. Maya didn't reply. She didn't need to. The truth was already out, and the crowd knew it. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Then, the distant sound of sirens filled the air. The crowd shifted, people whispering to each other as the noise grew louder. Several black cars and an official-looking vehicle turned onto the street, stopping sharply near the patrol cars. The doors opened, and a group of uniformed men and women stepped out. At the center was a tall figure in his late 50s, wearing a crisp suit instead of a naval uniform, but his presence was unmistakable. It was Admiral Jonathan Carter. The moment he appeared, the air changed. His reputation had preceded him, but his commanding presence now filled the street with a gravity that no one could ignore. People who didn't even know him directly could feel the respect he carried. The crowd instinctively grew quieter, their cameras still rolling but their voices hushed. The Admiral's eyes immediately found Maya. His face softened for just a moment as he saw his daughter safe, standing firm. Then his gaze turned cold and sharp as he looked at the officers. He stepped forward with measured strides, each one filled with quiet authority. "What," he began slowly, his voice deep and steady, "is happening here?" The first officer's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He stammered for a moment, trying to gather words, but the Admiral raised a hand slightly, silencing him without effort. Maya finally spoke, her voice calm. "Dad, I was walking home. He stopped me. Twice." The Admiral turned his head, his expression unreadable. He didn't raise his voice, didn't shout, but the weight of his silence was heavier than any words. He looked at the second officer, who quickly lowered his gaze, unwilling to meet the Admiral's eyes. The crowd leaned in, every person eager to capture what was unfolding. They knew this wasn't just about a young woman and a police officer anymore. This was about power, respect, and truth colliding in front of them. Finally, the Admiral spoke again. "Do you understand who you have threatened?" he asked the first officer, his tone still calm but sharp like a blade. The officer swallowed hard. I didn't know," he muttered. "That," the Admiral said firmly, "is exactly the problem." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone knew what he meant. It wasn't about knowing her identity. It wasn't about her being his daughter. It was about the fact that she was a human being who deserved respect regardless of her family name. The officer had failed to see that. By now, more officials had arrived. Higher-ranking supervisors from the police department pushed through the crowd, their faces pale as they realized who was involved. They tried to speak, but the Admiral's presence alone made them hesitate. Maya remained calm, though inside she felt a mix of relief and unease. She hadn't wanted things to escalate to this level, but now that they had, she knew there was no going back. The first officer finally tried to defend himself. She was uncooperative," he stammered. The Admiral's eyes narrowed. "Uncooperative? You mean she told you no?" His words cut through the air like a sharp wind. The crowd murmured in agreement. Some even whispered, "That's all she did." The officer had no answer. His face flushed, and sweat formed on his forehead. He looked smaller now, standing in front of the Admiral and the watching crowd. The Admiral turned back to his daughter. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft again. "Yes, Dad," Maya said, her voice steady. "I'm fine." Her calmness seemed to impress even him. She had handled herself with dignity and strength before he arrived, and he knew it. Turning back to the officers, the Admiral spoke with finality. "This will not be forgotten. Every word, every action here tonight has been recorded. You will answer for it?" The police supervisors nodded quickly, already pulling the first officer aside, their faces tense with worry. They knew the consequences would be severe, not just because of who Maya was, but because the entire incident was already in the hands of the public. Videos would spread. Questions would be asked. The truth could not be hidden. The crowd began to disperse slowly, though many kept their cameras rolling until the very end. Some whispered words of encouragement to Maya as they passed. "Stay strong," one woman said softly. "You did the right thing." Maya gave a small nod of gratitude. She wasn't seeking praise, but the support of strangers warmed her heart. As the official cars prepared to leave, the Admiral placed a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. His face was calm, but his eyes carried both pride and fury. He knew the storm that was about to come, and he was ready to face it not just as a father, but as a leader who demanded accountability. For Maya, the night had ended, but the story was far from over. The world now knew what had happened. The videos would travel far beyond the street, and the incident would ignite conversations that could not be silenced. She had stood her ground, and now the consequences of her courage were beginning to unfold. The night of the incident had ended, but its echoes carried far beyond the street where it happened. By the next morning, videos of Maya's calm resistance and the confrontation with the officers had spread across social media. Thousands of people had watched the clips, and the story began to grow larger with every passing hour. News outlets picked it up, journalists began calling, and hashtags filled timelines. For Maya, the attention was overwhelming. She had not asked for any of this. Her only intention had been to walk home peacefully and stand her ground when treated unfairly. Now, the entire country seemed to know her name. Strangers praised her strength, while others debated what the incident revealed about power and respect. Her phone buzzed non-stop with messages. Friends sent her screenshots of posts praising her courage. Some wrote long paragraphs telling her that her calmness had inspired them. Others admitted they had faced similar situations but never had the chance to be heard. Maya read these messages quietly, humbled but also heavy-hearted. She never wanted the spotlight, she just wanted fairness. At home, her father, Admiral Carter, was deeply engaged with officials and investigators. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Reports were written. Statements were taken from the officers, the supervisors, and the bystanders who had recorded the event. The Admiral himself was firm but measured. He demanded accountability, not because the victim was his daughter, but because the principle of justice demanded it. Within a week, the police department released an official statement. They acknowledged the misconduct and confirmed that both officers involved were suspended pending a full investigation. The public reaction was swift. Many people applauded the action, while others insisted it was only the beginning. Citizens began calling for deeper reforms, questioning how often such situations happened when no cameras were present and no family names carried weight. Maya watched all of this unfold with mixed emotions. She felt relieved that the truth was finally visible, but she also felt the burden of being a symbol in a larger conversation. She hadn't chosen to be a representative voice, yet her story had become part of something much bigger. A few days later, she received an invitation to speak at a community gathering. At first, she hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was ready to stand before a crowd and share her story. But her father encouraged her gently. "Maya," he said, his voice soft but steady, "sometimes life places us in positions we don't choose. The question is, will we run from them, or will we rise to them?" She thought about his words long into the night. By morning, she knew her answer. When the day came, Maya walked onto a small stage at a local community center. The room was filled with people, neighbors, students, activists, parents, and even local leaders. The cameras of journalists lined the back wall. The crowd quieted as she stepped to the microphone. Her heart pounded, but she remembered the calmness she had carried that night. She let that same calmness guide her now. "I never expected to be standing here," she began, her voice clear. I never wanted my walk home to become a national story. But it did, and I think there's a reason for that. She paused, scanning the faces in the room. The reason isn't because of who my father is. The reason is because every person deserves respect. Every single one of us. I shouldn't have needed my father's name for the truth to matter. What happened to me is part of a much larger story, one that many people live every day, unseen and unheard. Her words struck a chord with the audience. Some nodded, some wiped quiet tears, and some leaned forward, listening closely. I want to be clear, Maya continued. This isn't about anger. It's about dignity. It's about remembering that authority should never be used as a tool of intimidation. Authority should protect, not harm. Respect should never depend on someone's background, family, or status. Respect should be the starting point for everyone. Her speech was simple, but it carried power. The strength was not in loud declarations, but in the sincerity of her calm, steady words. By the time she finished, the audience rose to their feet in applause. Cameras flashed, but what mattered most to Maya was the hope she saw in the eyes of ordinary people who had come to listen. In the weeks that followed, conversations grew louder across the country. Universities invited her to speak. Organizations asked her to join discussions on fairness, dignity, and reform. Maya accepted only a few, choosing her moments carefully. She wanted her voice to add value, not just noise. Meanwhile, the investigation into the officers concluded. Official reports confirmed their misuse of authority. One officer was dismissed from his position permanently, while the other received disciplinary action and retraining. The department announced new guidelines for community interactions, promising stricter oversight and accountability measures. For many, it was a small step in a long journey, but it was a step nonetheless. Through it all, Maya remained grounded. She didn't let the attention change her. She still visited the cafe with her friends, still walked the same streets, and still lived with quiet dignity. But she also understood that her life had changed in ways she could never fully reverse. She was no longer just Maya, the Admiral's daughter. She had become a symbol of resilience, someone who showed that calm courage could stand up against intimidation. One evening, months after the incident, Maya and her father sat together on the porch of their home. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and gold. The Admiral looked at her, pride clear in his eyes. You know, he said softly, when you were a little girl, I always told you that strength isn't about how loud you can shout. It's about how steady you can stand when the wind is against you. That night, you showed the world what that means. Maya smiled gently. I didn't feel strong that night, Dad. I was scared. But I knew I couldn't let fear decide for me. He nodded slowly. That's exactly what courage is. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the crickets and the soft rustle of leaves. The world outside was still busy, still filled with challenges, but in that moment, Maya felt peace. She had faced something unfair, she had stood her ground, and in doing so, she had helped spark a conversation that stretched far beyond herself. Her story was not about being the daughter of an admiral. It was about being a human being who deserved respect and making sure the world remembered that everyone else did too.